Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. We're really excited to have you all here. Yesterday marked 1 year since George Floyd was murdered. Justice should be George Floyd being home with his family, his loved ones. Instead, we are reminded again to speak against state-sanctioned violence and police violence. Today, here in the UK, is also the 50th anniversary of the Misuse of Drugs Act 1971 here in the UK, also known as 50 Years of Failure. So we thank you all for joining us today to discuss issues and solutions to decolonize racist drug policy. In this webinar, we will look at the history of the drug war and how this global war has been used to uphold racist and colonialist systems around the world, with a specific focus on countries that have experienced British colonization. The war on drugs has failed in its stated goal of reducing drug use and sale, and has resulted in a devastating trail of trauma, pain, and suffering for families and communities, with communities of color facing the harshest impact. Drug laws were never based in science. Drug laws in the US, for example, were rooted in racism, and UN mechanisms were used to export these laws to the rest of the world using the 3 drug conventions, which countries had to sign and incorporate into national drug laws. Various countries have since imported this failed policy, and in countries of the global south, it has become an extension of colonization, as we will hear from Aggrey, Tripti, and Shaun. Globally, Black, Brown, and Indigenous people have been disproportionately targeted for drug law enforcement and face discrimination across the criminal system. They face higher arrest, prosecution, and incarceration rates for drug offenses, despite similar rates of drug use and selling among different races. This global war on drugs, rooted in racism and colonialism, must be replaced by strategies grounded in science, health, dignity, and human rights. As the UN Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent said in 2019, the war on drugs has operated more effectively as a system of racial control than as a mechanism for combating the use and trafficking of narcotics. Global drug policy has been used to justify excessive surveillance, criminalization and targeting, and even killing of Black, Brown, and Indigenous people. Those targeted are disproportionately penalized and denied access to treatment or alternatives to incarceration. Tolerance of racist policing practices, entrenched racial disparities, and ongoing selective enforcement of the law are no longer acceptable. We need to question drug policy and the institutions that profit from and enable them. Should the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, which is tasked with dealing with crime, handle drug use, which is primarily an issue of health, socioeconomic status, and bodily autonomy? An organization that lacks explicit reference to and support for harm reduction in their strategy, is this appropriate? An organization that pushes for mass rehabilitation centers where voluntary treatment is rarely voluntary, as we've seen in Sri Lanka, where UNODC procured building materials to support the refurbishment of a specialized voluntary drug rehabilitation center, even though there have been extensive reports of abuse and ill treatment in drug detention facilities. Even the treaties predating the current drug control conventions were grounded in control and colonial trade interests. The US and the UK drew on racist narratives to justify controls while benefiting from trade. Drug control policies were deployed to consolidate trade gains and unequal power relations. For this reason, we see the current drug control framework as grounded in white supremacy. We believe we must interrogate our ongoing investment in these systems, including the role of UN actors. We need to ask these questions, get answers, and implement solutions. Do we need agencies like the Drug Enforcement Agency in the US, which costs US taxpayers $3.1 billion in 2019? Since 1971, the United States alone has spent more than $1 trillion on the war on drugs. Do we need to contribute to the prison complex where 2.5 million people, 20% of total prison population, are in prison because of drug offenses? These are some of the questions we hope to answer. So now let me turn to Kojo Koram, lecturer in law at the Birkbeck School of Law, University of London, who will help us to understand how we can change current approaches. Thank you, Kojo.
Thank you, Colleen, and thank you for everybody who's taken the time to join us here today to talk about this urgent and necessary topic. What I'm going to do in my brief time with you is to just try and lay out a little bit of the architecture of international drug prohibition and really try and illuminate the ways that it reinforces and resonates with histories of racial and colonial control. I have so many fantastic colleagues who are here to join us today who are going to talk about the specific ways in which this architecture reproduces itself within specific jurisdictions, from South Africa to the United Kingdom. But what I want to do is to really try and tell a little bit of the history of how we got here and the way in which what we now come to see as the norm, as almost common sense, this system of international drug prohibition, this idea that the war on drugs is the only way that we can really confront the use of psychoactive substances. How do we get to arrive at this stage? I think we've really got to try and begin the story with the way in which the globalization and commodification of psychoactive substances that we now call drugs is really interwoven with the European colonial project. Now, of course, anthropologists have shown that societies from as far back as they can record have had some sort of engagement with psychoactive substances, whether that be religious or ritualistic or cultural. But in terms of becoming global commodities that are being traded and consumed across a transnational marketplace, the use of what we now call drugs really exploded with the European colonial project. In fact, you could say that psychoactive substances drove the European colonial project in many of its specificities. Think about some of the most significant substances that become global commodities in this era: tobacco, sugar, coffee, and alongside that, we need to think about opium, and we need to think about marijuana, and we need to think about cocaine. We need to think about the enormous cocaine plantations that the Dutch Empire used to produce in its East Indies and in Java, what we now call Indonesia. We need to think about the way in which in the 19th century, the British Empire, which we now will see from my other speakers, has had this huge legacy of prohibition across the world, was in fact the world's most successful and largest drugs trader. So successful that in the middle of the 19th century, it even launched wars against the Qing dynasty of China for the right to sell the opium that it was producing in the Indies. Even when we get to the very end of the 19th century, because of this commercial investment in the trade of what we now call drugs, we actually have a Royal Commission on Opium in 1895 in the United Kingdom detailed that they consider opium to have no evidence of extensive moral or physical degradation. In fact, any attempt to prohibit opium, according to one of the great thinkers of kind of European liberalism, John Stuart Mill, in his book On Liberty, he describes the attempt to prohibit the sale of opium as being evil in and of itself. But yet, less than a century later, we get to the middle of the 20th century, as scholars like Rick Lyons have shown, in the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs in 1961, the foundation of our current system of international drug prohibition, we have in the preamble the use and trade of drugs as being described as evil, one of the very few examples of that language being used in international law. How do we get that transition in less than a century from the trade and commercialization of drugs being seen as an essential part of European colonial capitalism to being this threat to humankind that needs to be expunged with the violent mobilization of the law? I think that has a lot to do with the way in which ideas around colonial ordering and racial ordering shift and adapt in this intervening period. And as Colleen kind of identified in her introduction, it has a lot to do with the emergence of the United States of America and its particular form of a new post-colonial imperialism. Because of course, America understands itself as not a colonial state. In fact, as in its founding myth, an anti-colonial state with its opposition towards British colonialism. But its relationship with drug prohibition is tied to its own imperial ambitions, primarily the actions that were taken in the United States when it received Philippines alongside other places like Guam and Cuba following the Treaty of Paris, following the conclusion of the war with Spain in 1898. But it picks up, for the purposes of drug prohibition, significantly the Philippines. And as part of its project of remaking the native population of the Philippines, one of the big ambitions of the American state at that particular time is to try and remove the usage and consumption of opium from the culture of this particular new colony of theirs. We can look at the writings of Charles Henry Brent, who actually ended up being the chairman of the very first international drug prohibition conference, when the United States used its rising power to bring the likes of the United Kingdom, France, and the other major European powers to the table with the Shanghai Opium Commission in 1909. Charles Henry Brent says that one of the major blockages from making the native population into Christians is their use of opium. And this needs to be removed in order to stop this drug stealing the souls of the natives, as well as the Americans who are living in this colony, in his words. And so from the 1909 Shanghai Opium Commission, we get this new era of understanding the relationship between drugs and the kind of civilizing mission of European colonialism, in which the expulsion of drugs, the removal of drugs, is seen as a necessary element from turning the more kind of backward and uncivilized native people into this vision of the rarefied and sovereign civilized subject. But of course, there's a real bind in that, because what we see happening with this early era of American drug prohibition is this insistence on turning the natives into civilized subjects, whilst at the same time having this insistence that they can never be as civilized as the white Americans in which they are supposed to be modeling. And so you get this bind that the individuals are caught in, and this leads to the acceleration of a legal and political system that facilitates greater and greater violence upon those individuals who are seen as being associated with these dangerous psychoactive substances. And we can see that when we start to look at the statistical information around who have been the people who have suffered the heaviest weight of international and national drug prohibition in the subsequent years. We can look at the geographical ordering of international drug prohibition, the what used to be known as the supply side heavy geographical weight of it, where those countries and those areas that were seen as producing and cultivating these substances face the lion's share of the violence of counter-narcotics programs, whether we think about Plan Colombia or the Meridian Initiative, or all these other examples of places in Latin America, or the Horn of Africa, the Far East Asia, all of these places facing the violence of international drug prohibition. Even when we look inside the countries of the so-called consumer areas, the global north, the United States and the United Kingdom, we can start to see, again, that racial ordering behind who's facing the heaviest weight of international drug prohibition. We look at the way in which the war on drugs became the facilitator of the conveyor belt into a system of mass incarceration for huge amounts of the Black American community. We can look at the way in the United Kingdom, drugs continue to be the main reason behind stop and search, which of course has huge disproportionate impact upon the Black British community and other ethnic minority communities. And so we can see some of the ways in which the history and the way in which what some people describe as the American experiment of international drug prohibition, which really became one of the flagship foreign policies of the United States of America, one of the things that are used to try and create a particular universal vision of what a civilized post-colonial world might look like, has had the consequences of actually reproducing and in some cases accelerating the racial and geographical divisions within the world. With that point, I think I might call my contribution to a close there and leave the floor for some of my other panelists. And if there's any further questions, hopefully I'll have the opportunity to engage and respond to them in the question and answer session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kojo. And yes, please, if you do have any questions, just pop them into the Q&A so that we can get to them later in the session. Next, I'd like to introduce Aggrey Aluso. He is the Health and Human Rights Program Manager for the Open Society Initiative for Eastern Africa, based in Kenya. Aggrey, over to you.
Thank you, Colleen, and good afternoon, everybody, and good morning, colleagues from the other sphere. So I think I will just build on from where Kojo left, but drawing specific examples from the East Africa, very, very related and connected, examples. Just to note that it's an interesting coincidence that today morning we had a conversation organized by our partner Vocal KE, I think, who are in this call, and Unite, in response to, in a response to a recently passed amendment to the narcotic and psychotropic drugs, in Kenya, the 1994 Narcotic and Psychotropic Substances Act, which I think a latest attempt has been by the legislators in Kenya to enhance their, make the penalties stiffer in an attempt to, according to them, reduce use of narcotics. But that's very, very familiar narrative that has been with us for quite some time. And as Kojo pointed out, the use of, mind or mood-altering substances isn't something that has been with humanity ever since documented history. I think it's an inevitable phenomenon within a human society that people would use mood-altering substances. And I think there's been contention or less of it in the previous, establishment prior to the colonial experience in Africa, particularly. And I think more so contentious and moralistic framing post-colonial. Just giving a brief, recap of history, which much of it has been mentioned by Kojo, that it's documented that use of alcohol, for example, was there, around 7,000 to 6,000 BC, hallucinogens, 8,000 to 5,000 BC, opium, mid-6th millennium, coca leaves, 6,000 BC, and cannabis about 8,000, BC. And cannabis, which is, a particular drug that has a lot of significance in the region that I come from, has a very rich historical and cultural place in our society. It's been used over time as, folk medicine in many cultures, including mine, as I will show, in the next few minutes. So in our traditional African society, cannabis was used in celebration, lots of celebrations and cultural rituals. And if you read an article publication by a person called Wensi, published in 1996, he recounts, the uses of cannabis. For instance, it was mixed with the palm wine to enhance a fermentation process, in production of alcohol. It was used by traditional doctors to treat human diseases, for example, filariasis and other illnesses, and also to manage evil spirits, according to the rich cultural beliefs of my people. Patients were washed with the mixtures containing cannabis to drive away evil spirits, and it was added in body lotions and used to embalm corpses, after people, exited this existence. Women used it as pastorate in order to enhance the sexual experience, and it was mixed with oil to enhance, hair growth. I think that has been commercialized, and we see a lot of hemp now being sold, for commercial purposes, and those were very indigenous to us. Just closer to where I come from, and I'm taking this call from a place in Western Kenya region where we have a very rich documented history of the use of cannabis pre-colonial. The Luo community of Kenya, for example, call this substance nyasore. They have a very indigenous name to it. And it was governed by very clear rules and norms. It was consumed by men and few women. Mostly women would use them in company of their spouses or their boyfriends. And it was used in designated places and occasions, and rules existed on how it was used. For example, young men, you had to use it within a company. You couldn't use it alone. Some process very similar to what we now call supervised consumption. And during these processes, also as people partook in the communal recreational use of cannabis, for instance, those who are not pulling their weight, who are not conforming to the societal norms, who are not, supporting their families or had issues with their families, were chided. Like this was a moment to really put people in line in this very warm social moment. Unfortunately, in the colonial and post-colonial era, the narrative changed, tremendously with the advent of colonization. Cannabis, became something that was perceived, and because that's the most common drug here, in the colonial and pre-colonial era, and therefore the post-colonial. It was branded, something that was considered, an impediment to development, and other drugs were now branded as impediments to development that needed to be regulated, and legislation now had to be imposed, to restrict and impose very highly punitive measures, and any attempt to bring a conversation in this current period is actually considered Western ideology. We've owned it. So the colonial experience brought it to us and used very deep, narratives of moralizing the whole thing, using religious indoctrination, painting it as dark, and worthy practices that needed to be discarded along with other African cultural ways. And people really bought that narrative, and we really have put a lot of nuances around it now to frame it as something that is devilish, just to speak frankly. So the current drug policy that is enforced in Kenya and Africa at large are very, narrowly defined legacy of colonial legislation. In Kenya, for example, cannabis was banned before, just before independence, long before independence in 1933, and it was categorized as dangerous, part of the Dangerous Drugs Act. And that has been maintained. In 1994, they formally now enacted Psychotropic Substances Act, which actually enhanced some of the punitive provisions that existed. Evidence point to the fact that although drugs were originally not an issue, they were, like I said, they were systematically and deliberately framed as development impediment. And accounts of how Africans used these drugs in their cultural context, have been, really, really shelved, and we don't get very good accounts of how Africans managed and used these drugs without any problem, without a lot of problems actually. And instead, narratives of exaggerated impact have been what is dominant. You've seen how cannabis has been shifting from, one classification, one categorization to the other. And it's ironic that countries in Europe and North America are now rediscovering the same medicinal values that Africans and other colleagues from the Southern Hemisphere had actually known for a long time, and had really embedded in their cultural practices. But this does not inform the current conversation around drugs. That bit has been lost, and now we have new information that shows us how good this drug is. But we had a very rich cultural history on the use of these, drugs for cultural and, medicinal value. So in my conclusion, without a doubt, drug prohibition has been a historical wrong, which needs to be corrected. Everywhere, as been pointed out, it's been used selectively, disproportionately applied for certain categories of populations, depending on your ethnicity, depending on your race, depending on the geographies that you come from. And as Canada and the US lead in the discovery of cannabis as a relatively harmless drug and not the gateway drug, hard drug that it was characterized in the 90s and 80s. Questions actually remain why Africa didn't acknowledge that its its value was first in the first place, and why, and now our African colleagues are stuck, on this board of argument. They'll call them board of argument. And the kind of conversations that went in the discourse that led to the reclassification of cannabis, where only 2 African states, voted to reclassify cannabis as a less and actually more less harmful drug and actually more beneficial drug in terms of medicine. So I will leave there so that we can progress with the other colleagues in the panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aggrey. Now we'll turn to Shaun Shelley, who's the Policy Advocacy and Human Rights Manager at TB HIV Care in South Africa. Shaun, are you there? There he is. Perfect.
Yeah, yes, I am. And apologies for the bandage on the middle of my head. Yes, so I'm going to be talking a little bit about the situation in South Africa, and I'm going to just share a screen so you don't have to stare at my broken head all the time. And anyway, so if we look at South Africa, we obviously had the sort of legacy of apartheid in the country, which was kind of I suppose, a dystopian colonialist dream in a way, where we had people oppressed, we had the creation of labor through people, and it was Robert Sobukwe who made this statement about the Shambok, which became the symbol of colonialism and oppression in South Africa. And really what we saw in South Africa was the attempt to divide people and to take over the natural resources of the country, which certainly happened. And then when we finally got to a stage of becoming apartheid and dismantling the apartheid system, there was a lot of critical examination of many of the sort of imposed policies and ways of looking at things. But there were also a number of facts that were accepted as facts that possibly weren't facts. They were just ideas. And it was Fanon who said, that imperialism leaves behind germs of rot. And certainly there were germs of rot in South Africa. And these accepted facts, or one of the big accepted facts, as we've heard, was the presumption that all drugs were evil. And this led to the kind of acceptance that it was okay to target people. And the irony of the statement, which you see here about making our own shambox, is that it really shows how the process of colonialism colonizes not only the land, but the people as well, to become a perpetual machine of oppression against themselves, and to keep people in a struggle which is artificially created. And the war on drugs certainly has done that. And we got politicians comparing drug use to apartheid, which is just a shocking thing that wasn't even spoken out against. This particular statement that you see here was made by the leader of the opposition in South Africa, and there was no complaints. They feel that drug use is as bad as apartheid to some people. Which it clearly is not even shouldn't even be in the same category. And what this led to was that we had this shifting of resources that were previously used to police apartheid, and we shifted them to the policing of drugs. And what I mean by resources is not only the Caspers, the militarized vehicles, the military, the physical shifting of resources, but I'm talking about resources such as the bypassing of certain laws. I'm talking about the resources of the way in which certain human rights violations were considered justifiable under the apartheid regime. They are now justifiable in the war on drugs. And so we've witnessed the perpetuation of apartheid-style policing and a kind of continuation of a lot of the apartheid human rights abuses and travesties of justice under the war on drugs. There's been a repurposing of the same thinking. And certainly communities have been terrorized more recently by a different kind of gang, which is the state gang of the police and the army. And so we've seen the perpetuation of the colonial and the imperial through the myth of the international, but this continues. Okay? And the belief that drug use is so problematic, we've seen things like the justification of Chinese experts training police in South Africa. We've got the Drug Enforcement Agency training police in South Africa. Now, if anybody thinks that the Drug Enforcement Agency has got an ounce of credibility left, you know, they obviously haven't been doing much of the reading or even looking at the press, because this is a major problem. They're a sort of a pariah organization, even in their own country. And here we are getting them to train people in an African context where we've heard previously there wasn't much focus on criminalizing drug use. You know, this is definitely the most colonial of policies that we currently have in South Africa, or one of the most colonial. It's not the most, perhaps, but it's one of them, certainly. And if we look at some of the reports that we've got in the press, this constant presence in the law enforcement world of American influence, in particular Chinese influence as well. We also have the Russian African anti-drug dialogue. So we've got these three superpowers competing in a way to put their ideas into a country which is supposed to be getting rid of imperialism and colonialism. And we see it even in a more subtle way. And so we've got the South African National Council on Alcoholism and Drug Use, and they are funded largely now by the American Department of State. And if we look a little bit more closely, we find that the International Technology Transfer Center, which replaces the ATTC, and just to be clear, I'm actually on the advisory board of them, may need to keep an eye on things, but they are then supporting and supported by the same mechanisms that support the International Society of Substance Use Professionals, which might sound very innocent and innocuous, but in actual fact behind that, you've got the SICAD, the Inter-American Drug Abuse Control Commission. You've then got the Bureau of Narcotics, International Narcotics and Law Enforcement. And effectively, we've got the continuation of imperialist ideas and a different kind of colonizing, in that we are colonizing police forces. We're putting foreign police forces and personnel and expertise on the ground in South Africa. And this is particularly problematic when we look at, for example, a lot of the work that's being promoted. It's purely on demand and supply reduction. And we're finding that the conflation between drugs and drug use and international transnational crime is increasing. And so we're getting calls to bring back the death penalty for drug sellers, for example, not realizing that the vast majority of drug sellers are just subsistence sellers. So we must remember that decolonization is not simply the absence of the colonizer. It was Steve Biko who said the most potent weapon of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. And we're certainly seeing how we haven't critically examined issues of drug policy in South Africa, how we have assumed that the international myth that all drugs are bad and dangerous and they are capable of great evil, we've assumed that to be correct. And this has justified all manner of continued forms of imperial ideas and colonization taking place in South Africa. Hopefully, we will get to an end of that, and we will finally wake up and bring back the activists in our communities who will act again, not against their brothers and sisters, aunts and uncles who happen to use drugs, but will actually act against the powers that continue to enforce the oppression and pursue the interests of capital and finance and economic division, rather than building a strong nation and a free nation. I will give some of the solutions a little bit later, but just to finish, I'm paraphrasing Steve Biko there a little bit. My apologies if anybody's offended by that, but I think that this is true, and it's one of the most beautiful statements I've seen, is in time we shall be in a position to bestow on South Africa, and indeed people use drugs, the greatest possible gift, a more human face. And if we can do that, I think we're well on the way to overcoming the terrible impacts of colonization and imperialism in South Africa, especially when it comes to people who use drugs. So I'm going to leave it there, and thank you to my fellow speakers who've highlighted many of the issues which we are facing here in South Africa as well.
Thank you so much, Shaun. It is disturbing when you see that how the influence perpetuates even today. Let's turn now to Tripti Tandon, who's the Deputy Director of Lawyers Collective in India. Tripti.
Thank you, Colleen. And before presenting the Indian perspective, I just wanted to flag two broader questions, before we embark on this whole narrative around decolonizing drug policies. I think the first is whether the question of the colonial mindsets influencing the way we respond to drugs can be divorced from the question of alcohol and alcohol policies, because as many of the speakers pointed out, there was a particular mindset of the colonizing state that viewed the use of plant-based drugs, particularly cannabis, opium, coca, as harmful, whereas not alcohol use. And of course, those who defended the use of cannabis and opium can be quoted as saying, as one commentator from India said, opium may be regarded as the Indian parallel to wine and beer, may be regarded as wine and beer in Europe and America. And of course, for some anti-colonial crusaders like Gandhi, who was regarded as the father of the Indian independence movement, the fight against colonialism was intertwined with the fight against what he called intoxicants that rob people of their physical, moral, and spiritual capacities. So for Gandhi, the question was drugs, drink, and devil. And that's what he kind of founded the movement for independence here on. So really, I think, and of course, whether colonial mindsets are responsible for the fact that for drugs, they became a subject matter of international treaties and conventions, whereas alcohol escaped that project. So I think the question of alcohol policies cannot, in my opinion, be divorced or excluded from this narrative of decolonizing drug policies and questioning prohibition as a colonial project. A related issue is that of religious prescriptions and how they may be informing prohibition in several countries, especially Islamic countries. So speaking for South Asia, I know that in Bangladesh, the Narcotics Control Act includes alcohol as a Schedule B substance. And in Pakistan, in addition to drug control laws, you have the Hudud law based on Sharia principles, which criminalizes the consumption of drugs. And I'm also raising this because as Kojo and others pointed out, colonial mindsets, of course, were founded on Victorian and evangelical values, and that viewed natural plant-based drugs a particular way as resulting in the uncivilized native Indian. So I think the question of religion may also be explored as part of this whole decolonization narrative, and how whether we can escape that question if we are talking about reforming drug laws in their entirety. Coming now to the Indian experience, which I think to some extent follows what the panelists from Kenya and South Africa have spoken, but also substantially departs from that, is that, of course, the use of cannabis and opium for social, cultural, spiritual, medicinal use is well known in South Asia, centuries old. And the colonial state, in fact, did not introduce prohibition, but rather introduced commercially driven, revenue-oriented regulations to really capture the opium economy, regulation from seed to sale, as we now call it, through opium acts, and also brought cannabis under the purview of provincial excise laws to bring in a system of licensing and taxation. In fact, some aspects of this regulatory apparatus are still in force in India, such as the district opium officers who oversee the licensed opium cultivation and production in many parts of India. And of course, bhang and ganja still appear in the provincial state excise laws. And if India were to regulate cannabis, it had simply to just switch on this aspect of the law, which is in place. And ironically, it was in fact 100 years ago, precisely 100 years ago, when the nationalist movement in India started to view opium as, as perhaps Kojo also pointed out, at the opium trade as being responsible for maintaining, British colonial rule in the country. And there was this intertwining of anti-opium sentiments with anti-colonial sentiments, a glimpse of which may be seen in a resolution that the Indian National Congress passed in 1924. If I may just read a quote. It says, Congress is of the opinion that the policy of the government of India in using the drink and drug habit of the people as a source of revenue is detrimental to the moral welfare of India and would therefore welcome its abolition. So ironically, it was the government of India, the colonial state, that argued that the problem of opium abuse was rare in Indian society, and that the moderate use of opium and cannabis did not lead to any harm, a position that most of us reformers would today identify with. And in fact, it was the Indian nationalists, the anti-colonial movement, which joined hands with evangelicals and the temperance movement in Britain to support prohibition. And as a result of this, post-independence, prohibitionist sentiments are now ingrained in the Indian Constitution, where we have, fortunately, a non-binding directory principle, which calls upon the state to, in addition to raising the standard of living, nutrition, and public health of citizens, to also bring about the prohibition of consumption of drink and drugs that are injurious to health. Curiously, this article is not talked about in the context of alcohol, but is always cited in support of criminalization of drug use. In fact, much more than the international drug conventions. So the way I see it, I think the problem is not just that prohibitionist ideas have been appropriated by the post-colonial state and society, but the real problem is that they believe that this is the right thing to do, that it is right to criminalize drugs, it's right to criminalize psychoactive substances, and a glimpse of which can be seen in how the Indian Supreme Court, which struck down the anti-homosexuality law in Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code by decrying its colonial origins, believes that it is right to criminalize people who use or are involved with drugs. It is right to cancel bail given to people accused of drug offenses. And it is absolutely right to say, as it has done in a recent judgment, that poverty is not a mitigating factor in sentencing for drug offenses. And it was a case of, a very poor person who was, simply a courier. But the court said that there is no question of reducing the sentence because drug crimes are more heinous than murder and deserve absolutely no leniency. So really, I think while it's important to interrogate the origins of modern day drug control, and the colonial influence is absolutely clear, but simply recalling its colonial past is not good enough, in my opinion, because as I said, this mindset is now very deeply entrenched. And I think apart from pointing out the origins, it's also important to point out the lack of reason, the lack of rationality, science, and humanity in current drug policies. And I will come back on the solutions in a bit. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Tripti. Last but not least is the fabulous Imani Robinson, communications lead with Release, the UK Centre for Expertise on Drugs and Law, based here in the UK. Imani.
Hi, thank you all so much. So I'm going to weave together a few quotes that I've been thinking about. So in Black Resistance to British Policing, Adam Elliott Cooper writes, "Imperial amnesia enables Britain to remember America as a racist aberration rather than a former British settler colony. The fact that, unlike America, Britain didn't have plantation slavery on its mainland was not for moral or ethical considerations. Slave labor was most profitable in the Caribbean. This is why Britain trafficked Africans to Barbados and Grenada rather than Bristol and Glasgow. Indeed, England and Scotland both had colonies in the Americas before the Acts of Union that created the United Kingdom of Great Britain in 1707. Put simply, the UK has never existed without colonies and racial governance. This is how racialized categories, structural power, and organized violence are imposed. Colonization in Australasia, the Caribbean, the Middle East, North America, South and Southeast Asia, and nearly a third of the African continent made racism one of Britain's most enduring ideological exports. Keeping the dirty business of slavery, genocide, and racist rule physically distant from the British mainland, is one of the ways Britain has been able, or was able, to absolve itself of its shameful endeavors and retain its national pride. The thousands of miles that separated the British mainland from the overt racial governance of its colonies meant that it could also construct a conceptual barrier between racism and its own self-image. He continues, just as America is indelibly marked by racism through its histories of settler colonialism and slavery, Britain is similarly shaped by its own legacies of enslavement, colonial exploitation, and violence. So I want to return quickly also to Kojo's work, because you articulated so well, Kojo. So Kojo writes, to appreciate that racial classifications of difference are porous is to begin to better understand the violence that accompanies the instance of racist certainty. The subhumanity, the animalism, and the deviancy projected onto the racial subaltern subject is a betrayal of what already exists in potential with the idealized European human. So racism really goes further than a politics of different human identities. It actually configures who gets to be human. Or put in another way, the very category of the human, imbued as it is with the possibility of innocence, is never available to people racialized as Black. The war on drugs is the callousness, then, with which Black life is taken and justified without retribution. Drug policy reform must be driven by the transformation of our relationship to punishment, which is to say a radical commitment to a new world, or it means nothing at all. Carceral logics require us to believe that in order to create safe communities, we need policing, we need prisons, and we need surveillance. In other words, the criminal justice system is construed as an essential framework for how we understand what harm is and how to respond to it. But the criminal justice system does not tackle the root causes of harm. Instead, it sanctifies crime as a metric from which to gauge the morality and goodness of people, because the lives and behaviors of good people respect the authority of the state and commit to its continuation. Bad people, conversely, threaten the continuation of the state with their actions, beliefs, and behaviors. Instead of developing the tools and language to be able to resolve conflict and understand the root causes of harm, we give such a capacity away to something outside of ourselves. We look to carceral logics to determine how and when individual people will be punished, out of our hands. This is a problem because our relationship to the state precipitates a collective and learned helplessness, for which the antidote is a focused and intentional commitment to collective power, to mutual aid, community care, tools for resilience, and the deep and difficult work of conflict resolution, healing, and finding more sustainable and effective ways to respond to harm when it occurs. But so focused is punitive justice and carceral logics on punishing the individual for breaking a rule, so ill-equipped to address the root causes of harm, that our capacity to think and understand harm as collective rather than individual is deeply compromised. Collective power is not possible within logics that frame collective social issues as solely individual problems. This moral framework that is based on protecting wealth, ideal notions of humanity, and unchecked institutionalized state control over people and behaviors produces the architecture for the war on drugs and enforces punishment as the correct and only way to respond to such behaviors. In Abolition Geographies and the Problem of Innocence, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, which is a chapter by Ruth Wilson Gilmore in Futures of Black Radicalism. Ruth Wilson Gilmore writes, "We used to think that in the United States, contemporary mass unfreedom, racially organized, must be a recapitulation of slavery's money-making scheme. But if these massive carceral institutions, weighted like cities, are not factories and service centers, then where's the profit, the surplus money at the end of the day? Today's prisons," Ruth writes, "are extractive. What does that mean? It means prisons enable money to move because of the enforced inactivity of people locked inside of them. It means people are extracted from their communities and people are returned to communities, but not entitled to be of them, enabling the circulation of money on rapid cycles. What's extracted from the extracted is the resource of life, time." Now, in thinking through these overlapping phenomena of racial capitalism, of colonialism, and then of what we do as people invested in drug policy reform, as people who are using our time, which we, are able to have, right? We need to think really clearly about how best to use that time. And we can explore this a little bit later, but I just want to kind of underline the danger of traditional reforms is that we have sought to change or amend the rules or improve the technologies of punishment that punitive justice has in its cavalry, rather than try to interrupt such violence in its entirety. Traditional reforms, those that fall within this kind of police or carceral humanitarianism, as if policing and carcerality have any place in a free society, ultimately have not served to transform our collective relationship to harm, nor our learned obsession with punishment. Perhaps in the same way that the war on drugs is not primarily about the substances themselves, punitive justice is not about creating safe communities. Traditional reforms can thus be articulated as demands that necessitate collaboration with the very practices that sustain carceral and colonial geographies. Such reforms are immediately dangerous for some of us and wholly inadequate for all. Thanks. I have no more time.
Thank you so much, Imani. Let me invite all the speakers back now, and we can talk about some solutions. So maybe Kojo, will start with you and ask you for some of the things that you think we can do as next steps.
Hello. Well, first of all, thank you so much to all the other speakers. I learned so much, just from all of those responses and engagements as well. I think one of the first things we can do is really acknowledge that the current system isn't working, not even on its own terms. So, it was 1998 that the United Nations met under the banner of a drug-free world, we can do it. This commitment to the idea that, well, if we just continue to pour more resources into law enforcement, into mass incarceration, into counter-narcotics programs, into aerial fumigation policies, into crop eradication policies, if we keep imposing this violence more and more on people, eventually, there won't be any recreational use of these prohibited substances. And of course, we're seeing that this is a failure on its own terms and is simply leading to a condition of perpetual violence. So I think a recognition of that, first and foremost, needs to really be made strongly. And then secondly, I think there also needs to be a accounting of the harms that have impacted from the history of international drug prohibition, a recognition that if we are going to transition to another system, those harms need to be repaired, those harms need to be accounted for in order to allow the people who've felt the brunt of the violence most harshly to be able to reconfigure their lives. And I think that's going to require a kind of a shift of mindset and a re-education of the relationship between law, violence, race, and drugs, not only in what we would consider the global north, but also all across the world. You know, I think a lot of the contributors really highlighted how there has been this embrace of the idea that the pathway towards modernization, development, and civilization that the now at least formally independent post-colonial countries need to go through is through that purification policy process of drug prohibition. And I think trying to really make clear that that purification process is in fact part of the system of ongoing racialized violence, and that is a violence that needs to be repaired, is another point that we could try and look towards on the horizon.
Thank you, Kojo. Actually, Tripti, let me come to you next.
I think while of course questioning prohibition as a colonial legacy has helped, and that is that has been the narrative in the Indian media, or with those rare members of parliament who dare to question drug prohibition. But I think simply just that alone is not going to help. Overturning unjust drug laws will also require us to engage with questions on constitutionality, justice, fairness, and how drug laws may be violating human rights or fundamental rights, as we call them. And I think this is what led South Africa to decriminalize, cannabis for personal use. But the challenge for us really is that the few jurisdictions that have, examined drug policies from the lens of human rights have only done so with respect to personal use. They haven't really, the human rights framework hasn't helped us in questioning the full spectrum of prohibition, from production to trade to sale and supply. So I think that is I see that as a challenge. The other challenge is, of course, in envisaging an alternative. What is a decolonized drug policy? What does it look like in this very hyper-nationalistic narrative that we are seeing today, especially in India? So, are we going to replace a colonial drug policy with a nationalist drug policy? And what would that look like under Narendra Modi or Duterte, or for any of the, the nationalist fascist leaders that we have today? And I want to just bring in a third point where I perhaps may be diverting a little from, this larger question of race and oppression around drug policy. That, of course, that is wrong. But drug laws, when applied even to the rich and the powerful and the privileged, are also wrong. As we saw, last year in India, where drug laws were used against, Indian film stars and celebrities in the most ridiculous manner, and the injustice of that was also evident to a human rights lawyer like me. So it is, of course, its application and its further used to oppress the oppressed is wrong, but drug laws applied to anyone for that matter are wrong, in my opinion. So that shouldn't be lost sight of.
I wish the reactions could be loud so I could be clapping for all of them. But Imani, let me come to you next, and then we'll go to Aggrey and Shaun.
Okay. Is there like a specific, just any solutions?
What do you think are our next steps? What are some of the solutions we should be thinking about?
Well, I mean, obviously from my presentation, there's a focus on reevaluating our relationship to punishment that would be a new conversation, particularly within drug policy reform, but in general. And it sometimes feels frustrating because drug policy is one of those areas, particularly critical drug policy, where we know that punishment doesn't work, but there seems to be such a reluctance to deepen our commitment to really reevaluating how we respond in situations of harm, and really also being able to articulate what harm is, because so many of the harms or the perceived harms that drug policy is kind of predicated on are not actually necessarily harms at all, or absolutely not inevitable harms. So we talk about harm reduction really being basic common sense, really being like, not as costly as, for example, law enforcement, and yet it is under-resourced and not a priority. And so the solutions really have to go to thinking about the constructs within which we're working, that is the prison industrial complex, that is our relationship to carcerality, and that is going to require us all to learn from abolitionist organizers, and to really make a commitment to move away from colonialism, from oppression, to really be against hierarchy, dispossession, and exclusion in general, to really take seriously the calls to decriminalize, decarcerate, and defund the criminal justice system, policing, prisons, surveillance, within the war on drugs, but also in general. Ultimately, there is no solution that won't be based in collectivity and solidarity with other movements. The siloing of drug policy has enabled these colonial and violent systems to proliferate and to continue, because we can't dismantle those systems on our own. So yeah, this is sort of like being able to position ourselves as antagonistic contradictions of carceral geographies, of decolonial geographies, is really the long-term project and the pathway to solutions. But focusing less on solutions and more on like processes of what we're doing, I think is also helpful.
Thank you so much. Aggrey, we'll come to you.
Thank you, everyone. I think it's been very insightful conversation. Just to echo what colleagues have said, I think this is a moment that really calls for rethinking the whole discourse around drug policy, and I think Shaun mentioned it, that the coloniality, the concept of coloniality is not necessarily external. I think the worst bit of it remains with us in our minds, and in the African context, the indigenous coloniality, which now is the inherited form of this colonial infrastructure that used all these proxy laws like drug laws to balkanize and perpetuate injustice against certain defined group of people, really lives with us, deeply ingrained. And you've seen examples, for example, in Uganda, where they use such thinly veiled references of in attempt to disenfranchise certain demographics. So, for example, the president of Uganda used to call his competitor then, who is commonly known as Bobby Wine, as a drug user, and everybody who was following him was branded as a drug user, just because they're youthful, and anybody youthful and active and involved in active, position is just need to brand them drug users, and using the legal mechanisms now to contain, people from exercising their civic, freedom. So the concept of coloniality is more complex now than it was It's not of a question of us versus them. It's something that is deeply ingrained within our very fabric of our system that requires, a very robust conversation, narrative reframing that should really seek to rehistoricize this whole discourse of where it started and where it needs to go, and how it was not problematic and how it has been made problematic by these constructs that came with the colonizers. The tragedy we have now is that we have more fervent supporters of these very unjust laws within Africa than outside Africa. And the bulk of the work now lies within, and they have these powerful narratives from the churches, from the religious fronts, from all populist fronts. In as much as they're minority, but they carry the moral authority, and people do not think it's politically correct to go against them, and they really utilize that. So for me, a solution really lies in really historicizing this discourse and politicizing it in the way that it needs to be politicized within our continent and outside the continent, so that we have our own narrative about our relationship with this issue, and not the imported narratives that we have now owned, which were never ours in the first place. That's where I will pen off my point. Thank you.
Thank you, Aggrey. Shaun, please.
Yes, thank you very much to my colleagues and fellow panelists and that for really interesting input. I've been quite concrete in what I think should happen. To decolonize drug use, we need to do more than just simply decriminalize. We need a whole new system that rejects an imperialist agenda and the definitions that have been imposed on drugs and people who use drugs. Meaningfully decolonize means to me that as we move towards the inevitable legal regulation of drugs, that we need to accommodate drug sellers who provide a critical, unregulated economy in economically barren communities. Two, we must reject the demonization and deification of drugs and see them as value-neutral molecules capable of good and bad. We need to reject the criminal justice responses to drug use and subsistence growing and selling of drugs. We need to reject coerced and mandated treatment, drug courts, and diversion programs. We need to reject the over-pathologization or even the pathologization of drug use and people who use drugs. There was an interesting question by Kate about how this colonization affects the clinical processes, and definitely it does. Vast majority of people who use drugs do not need treatment. They need treatment for other medical issues, but we've got to get over this pathologization, which is simply the flip side of the criminal justice coin, except that sentence is a lifelong sentence and you keep paying for it because somebody worked out you can charge patients more than you can charge prisoners. Number 6 is change the narrative and see drugs as part of being human with many possible outcomes, many of which are actually good. 7, take a pragmatic response to any problems that arise, looking at first principles, not being influenced by the moral agenda. 8, see problematic drug use as primarily systematic rather than the failing of the individual. And perhaps most importantly, question every assumption and accepted truth, knowing that the war on drugs is at its core a weapon of imperialism and colonialism, and needs questioning at every single level to determine what the truth is, if there is any truth at all. The blind acceptance of current policies is nothing more than the continuation of colonization of South Africa and other countries, justified by the international myth that drugs are evil. And it is time to reject the policies that result in the oppression of our communities. And we really need to seriously look at what it means to decolonize our response to drugs and change it using a totally different paradigm rather than trying to modify a broken lens that exists currently.
Thank you so much, Shaun. We have been getting quite a few questions, so if you don't mind, I might turn to some of these. The first one is from Ruth Bergen. How do we match this discourse in a helpful way with, for example, the current Indonesian and Philippines approach to drugs and populist politics tied with sovereign rights? The irony is rich. How does it become rightly ripe for decolonization and reform from within these countries? Anybody? All right, ask anybody? Kojo maybe, or Tripti?
Colleen, I think I touched upon this a bit in my talk that it has to be, the questioning has to be also grounded in human rights, and of course seeing human rights as a Western imperial imposition is of course one of the challenges that we as human rights defenders always face. But really I think this is where just taking the whole cultural history, that context, and relating that with rights, freedoms may help. We've seen that being very helpful in our work on LGBTI rights in India, with the Indian Supreme Court recognizing transgender persons' rights and identities, and then getting rid of Section 377. And that was both the discourse, really the arguments there were both grounded in this kind of anti-colonial sentiment, as well as the more liberal rights discourse. So perhaps that is something to try out.
Thank you. There is a specific one, Kojo, for you, but I might just give a few questions and then see if any, who will, could answer them. So one is, are CBD sales happening in Africa? And how could people afford it or be able to grow it for their sustainability and food? The question specifically for Kojo, but for anybody, what has been the role of the pharmaceutical industry during the early days of shaping drug control conventions and in shaping the framework that would prohibit some drugs while controlling others? Another one, I would love to hear connections made to how the colonial mindset impacts clinical practice. What might be some implications of decolonization for harm reduction or substance treatment efforts? So maybe if we could have Kojo and Aggrey and Shaun respond to those.
Sure, I'm happy to respond to the kind of early framing of the drug control conventions. And, the really curious thing about the way in which that system of drug prohibition was implemented was that it was also a system of drug licensing. And it was this attempt to try and really demarcate the specter of drugs in its kind of demonic imagining and its associations with, denigrated and racialized human bodies, with the essential role that those very same substances play in our kind of medical process. It's almost the counter side of the story that I said with the introduction. And you can kind of even see it in the figures that emerged in the very early drug prohibition kind of meetings and organization. Charles Henry Brent, who was the American chairman of the Shanghai 1909 Opium Commission, you could almost see him as representing this kind of theological, colonial, racialized imagining of what drugs are. But the other American representative of the Shanghai Opium Commission was Dr. Hamilton Wright. And he kind of represents the kind of, this idea that, no, there is a medical use for drugs, there is an essential role for those, but that imagining of it with medical terms almost sharpens the distinctions between what then is seen as kind of dangerous drugs and allows the violence of dangerous drugs to be even stronger and to implement even harsher controls on them. And so we see that all the way through to the UN drug conventions that we have now, with the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs and the Psychotropic Convention and the Trafficking Convention. All of them contain this provisioning of the substances that they are on one hand prohibiting, but at the same time trying to lock within this sphere of legitimate medical use. And I think complicating and unpacking that binary that exists right from the very start of drug prohibition is going to be a key step in any project of decolonizing drug use.
Thank you. Shaun, Aggrey, do you want to take some of the other questions?
I'm happy to comment in particular on the great question that Kate posed about the connections between the colonial mindset and impacts on clinical practice. And we see this all the time, and Kojo has actually touched on it as well, this artificial division between what is a regulated and unregulated drug. The dangers of street drugs are largely due to lack of quality control and prohibition, which puts people in the position that they have to make stronger drugs in order to transport them more easily. And this narrative of new drugs is just unhelpful. In South Africa, we've got this drug that they call niobe. It's nothing more than street heroin, unregulated heroin. And yet we had rumors about it being a misuse of ARVs, which resulted in underdosing of ARVs amongst certain people, and the presumption that they were drug resistant because they had been using ARVs recreationally, which was just rubbish. And these kinds of demon drug narratives play out into clinical settings where, for example, we see people who have got legitimate pain not being given pain medications, when really we know that it's only 0.26% of people who are on long-term opioids for cancer pain will actually develop a problem with it. And even then, it only becomes a problem when you cut off their supply, because opioids are not particularly dangerous apart from causing respiratory suppression when taken in combination with other drugs or in high doses. But for opioid tolerant people, the easiest solution is take home doses of injectable diamorphine, which is heroin. And they've done that in the past and it's worked very, very well. So the idea amongst clinicians that these drugs don't have street analogs is just totally incorrect. People can't conceptualize that crystal meth or ice or tuk in South Africa is actually something that's legitimately used in medical circumstances, and that exact same drug taken in the right doses, even on a regular basis, is not framed as a harmful drug. So clinicians often forget that heroin is simply a prodrug for morphine, and they'll happily prescribe morphine, but they won't prescribe heroin. And so it impacts very, very strongly on the way people are cared for. And that in terms of CBD in South Africa, we've seen this emerging CBD sort of industry coming out, which is being more and more co-opted by big business and that. And a lot of people cannot afford that in South Africa. And in South Africa, to speak to Bernice's question later on, we've had 156,000 less arrests since the decriminalization of personal use. But there are also a lot of people who are being prosecuted for producing CBD oil and that kind of thing, because there are actually no thresholds. And as Anand Grover pointed out to me a while back, the cannabis legislation in South Africa, that overruling of the criminalization of cannabis use actually applies to any of the drugs, because it's a set of principles. It wasn't about the dangers of cannabis. It was about a set of principles, which are about right to privacy, right to freedom, and the right to bodily integrity. So I'd like to see how that develops in the future.
Thank you. Aggrey, do you want to add anything to that, or I can move on to another question?
Colleen, may I come in on the clinical practice or after Aggrey? Just some interesting insight from India, if I just may. So, it's interesting. So Indian law had allowed this quasi-medical use of opium and poppy, where people could register with the government and receive their supply of opium or poppy straw. And this practice was used until very recently. And then the Indian government decided to review it and set up a medical committee of, modern medicine practitioners to review this practice. And the committee came up with the idea that, there is no such medical use of opium anymore. And they recommended that the practice should be discontinued, and it was, resulting in hundreds of users of opium and poppy straw, mostly elderly, overnight being, turning into criminals, having to turn now to the black market to procure opium and poppy. And, they were previously respected in their communities and society, and suddenly they became criminals and a burden on their families. So I think that was really, really tragic. But really, I think this question of clinical practice and how we, view the traditional medicinal use of cannabis, opium, and coca, perhaps should come in when we look at the medical and scientific use exceptions that drug laws allow for. That medical use shouldn't just be what modern medicine sees, but also the indigenous traditional systems of healing and therapy must also count.
So probably just, yeah, if I could just add on that line. So I think part of the documented history, which I spoke about, was the rich, the rich history of use of opioids for, medicinal purposes, particularly cannabis, very well documented in Africa, and it's a practice that predated the colonial experience, but which was shelved or aggressively prohibited during the colonial occupation of most African countries. And even and of course with the narrative that come with it, of demonizing practices that were indigenous to the colonial subjects, it brought with it a lot of stigma that even now, with the acceptance and very proven facts about the effectiveness of opioid analgesics for management of pain, now in efforts to try and get people to use, for example, morphine, to be used, for management of, life-limiting conditions, pain-related to life-limiting conditions, you find a lot of resistance. So countries have made some tremendous because of the work of certain health activists, particularly those working in palliative care. For instance, in Uganda, where the laws have, we've really achieved quite significant progress in getting the laws and the policies to be revised to allow for use of opioid analgesics. Allowing even nurses to prescribe, in certain rural areas where doctors are not available. But the uptake is still very low, particularly for certain populations because of the affiliation with the prohibitionist, mindset, and particularly children who really are suffering and need those kind of interventions do not get them because of the association and the assumptions about their potential addictive nature and exaggerated, impact of such substances. So yeah, so those are some of the enduring colonial, stumbling blocks that really now will take a lot of effort to correct, and yet there's so many opportunities that existed, and these are widely available, substances. But I think in the effort, the very clear economic motivation of the colonial enterprise, which sought to monopolize commodities that had economic value, and if they could not monopolize them, then they were restricted. So cannabis and alcohol were some of them, and I'm glad Tripti talked about alcohol. Very relatable, where if you could not buy the bottle, taxable versions of alcohol, anything else you made from home was illegal. Yet in the same colonizers' homes, they had homemade beer, they had homemade whiskeys, which were not categorized as illegal or illicit. So the whole, and somebody talked about this whole idea of illicit, just need to be described, because we use it, widely, illicit, and it carries a connotation, the demonized connotation, that even however much reforms you may get around it, if it still carries this connotation of illicit, it just has that negative, character within it that would really take a lot of time to get people to go around it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I know we have a few more questions, but I'm looking at the time, and so we'll just take the one last question, which is, can the panelists address the role of gendered violence within the racialized violence of post-colonial societies that criminalize and prohibit drugs and alcohol? I'm not sure who would like to take that one on.
So Colleen, I'd actually signed up for that. Yeah, so I found that question very interesting and powerful, and it just resonates with the very intention of these colonial prohibitions and use of proxy laws, most of which found their way through this drug policies or drug-related laws. And really, if you look at the history of them and the character of these laws, they're targeted to profile people of certain characteristics, either gender or ethnic, or regions. And depending on the layers of intersection, how much of those issues they targeted as morally unacceptable, socially undesirable traits that you hold, they would impact on you with more intensity, depending on the levels of intersecting forms of marginalization that you faced. And we've seen that really playing out within the gender lens, where we see various layers, drug policies being, a theater of intersecting marginalization. So if you are poor and you are a woman and you are of a certain color and you are using drugs, then chances are you are going to be netted by these drug policies. And we've seen that in Kenya, for instance. There's a study we did, just looking at the impact of these drug policies on a wide range of people that are being targeted. We didn't have very specific description of who we are analyzing the impact on. But it came out very clearly that most women in the area where the enforcement is very aggressive, prisons are filled up with mostly women, younger women, who are of certain economic status, and mostly who are low-level drug users, very dependent, and who are being used mostly by the trafficker as as the couriers for the drug. So that means they're really low-level, very marginalized people who had been chased away from their home. And the fact that this found a convergence between the colonial objectives and the cultural objectives, where women are already marginalized by culture. And therefore, even in the enforcement of this drug policy, the law enforcement officers are more particular and more keen to make sure that a woman who is deviating. So they look at you as a social deviant, somebody who needs to be controlled and is not to be controlled, or they deem you as having deviated. They really are more keen and police women with more ferocity than men, because they think you're doing something that is culturally wrong. And then it has all these other motivations that come with it. You're also easy to exploit. You also don't have a social support system around you. Women are likely to be rejected by their families if they get into drug use. They're likely to be the ones that are left in the dens when the police raid, because they're probably having children or are pregnant or have certain health challenges. So just a conflation of so many factors which are historical in nature that keep compounding and conflating with the current one. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I know that I'm getting messages about the time, so I just want to say thank you for joining us today. Thank you to our amazing speakers, Tripti, Imani, Aggrey, Shaun, Kojo. We so appreciate your time today. And we look forward to all of you joining us for the next webinar in the series, which will be on the denial of Indigenous rights, which will be held on August 9th, which is the International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples. As a colonial construct, the global drug control regime has undermined the rights of Indigenous peoples, including the right to self-determination and to practice and revitalize their cultural traditions and customs, obliging all states to abolish traditional uses of coca, cannabis, and opium by means of crop eradication and drug law enforcement. And we've heard excellent examples of these from Aggrey and others today. The next, this webinar in August will shed light on the conflict between the drug control regime and Indigenous rights and challenge prevailing narratives that these tensions are possible to reconcile while the UN retains the goal of a society free of drugs. I think that we have had such a rich discussion today, and I cannot thank you all enough. And from everything that's been said and some of the solutions, we know now we need to combat the perpetuation of colonial power through international drug control conventions and the resulting prohibitionist drug policy, and raise awareness of drug policy colonization and its impact in countries on public health, criminalization, and regulation to begin the process to dismantle this extremely destructive policy. And we need to advocate for funding to be redirected, as Imani said, from punitive drug policies and be invested in social and community programs for all people, as Shaun said. We need to change approaches to harm reduction, as raised especially by Kate in the questions. We need to decarcerate, and we need to have dignity and reparations for those who have been negatively impacted by racist drug policies. So once again, I thank you all. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for your participation. And we hope to see you next time. Thank you for being with us today. Bye, everyone.